I suspect that most of you were in my earlier talk. Thank you. Thank you for coming back. I appreciate it. So I want to drill down a little bit deeper and stop talking about the philosophy of DevOps and talk a little bit more about the actual practice and the actual tools. And in particular, I want to talk about Azure Pipelines, which is certainly my favorite bit of the Azure DevOps stack. And that's actually new for me because I did come from a dev background, and I worked at Microsoft and at GitHub, and even before that, I worked on version control tools. So the version control aspect of Azure DevOps has historically been where I've paid all the attention, but actually Azure Pipelines has sort of, I don't know, I hate to sound romantic about a bit of software, but it's sort of stolen my heart, and I'm really very fond of it. I realize now that I'm using a very similar couple of slides, so I'm not gonna, I think we covered the what is DevOps earlier today and why it's important and a lot about the philosophy behind it. So I'm not going to belabor too much the point of DevOps and the advantages of actually using DevOps, again, as a practice. But I do want to again say that we do think that at Microsoft, DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our customers. So I think we talked a lot about the process, and I think you've got people in your organization already. And so now I want to dig a little bit deeper into the products themselves, and again, in particular, into Azure Pipelines. So again, the goal behind Azure DevOps as a suite of products is to allow you to plan your work using Azure boards, or of course, whatever you want to use. If you want to use Jira, that's fine too. We can plug in across the entire ecosystem, and then use Azure repos to host that code to allow for code reviews and support pull requests, and then Azure Pipelines to take that code out of your Git repository. Again, whether it's in Azure repos, whether it's in Bitbucket or GitHub, take that code, build it, and then deploy it into production. And again, I want that to be true whether you're deploying to Azure, to an on-premises server, whether you're packaging up a desktop application or a mobile application, or whether you're targeting a competitive cloud. I want Azure Pipelines to be the best build and deployment tool for whatever code you're building, whatever type of application, and wherever it's getting deployed. That is our goal at Microsoft. Even if that is, again, to a competitive cloud. That's fine. So the goal behind Azure Pipelines is to do that. It will do that build, and it will do that deployment step. This is true whether you're using Azure DevOps on premises. We recently renamed Team Foundation Server, the on-premises product, to Azure DevOps Server, so we have continuity between the names. So with Azure DevOps, you can build all that code. You can either bring your own build agents, so you can run your own agents inside your data center. And a lot of people do that, especially if they are, we have a lot of customers who are particularly nervous about their code leaving their environment. Maybe they're writing financial software, or they have really bespoke requirements. In the US, the medical industry is particularly scared about where things live. Or we have hosted build agents. So in Azure, we run a number of servers just for performing your builds. So we have Windows machines, of course, we have Linux boxes in Azure, and we have Macs, all ready to perform your builds. the thing that I think is fascinating and really pushing the envelope on Azure Pipelines is our container orchestration. So we think that deploying containers into the cloud is the state of the art, right? It's very simple to manage these things with Kubernetes. It's very, very hard to get your environments set up and then do a deployment to them. It's so much easier to build a container, package it, send it up to a container registry, and then deploy from there. We're also seeing a number of container-based builds. So the thing, we have all these nice build agents in Azure, and they've got a lot of software pre-installed, a lot. And for most people, that's probably enough for a greenfield project. If you're building a Node app, if you're building, a C app or a .NET app, most of the software that we have pre-installed is ready to go for you. However, if you have bespoke requirements, it's really painful to install these dependencies on our cloud servers because you're going to have to install them as part of your build process. That's slow or brittle, and it's often the least interesting part of your build, right? You may not even be able to install some of these things in an automated way or in a headless way. So you can actually bring a container to our build agents and actually do your build inside a container that already has all of your prerequisites installed. So instead of trying to download and install all those things, you just download the container and then run your build inside of it. Very, very straightforward. I think that that's a particularly compelling part of Azure Pipelines. The other thing that we're doing is we want to make Azure Pipelines the best platform for building and developing open source software. And I know that not all of you are working on open source projects. I suspect that some of you do, and that's great. I do, for instance. And our offer for open source projects is particularly, I think, impressive. So at Microsoft, we've got a relatively brief history of open source, but I would like to try to convince you that we sort of get it now. We didn't always. When I started at Microsoft, open source was a challenging thing for us to use, let alone create and produce. But in 2018, now 2019, I think we have a much more compelling story. We open source a lot of our software like VS Code, like .NET Core, and we use a ton of open source within Microsoft. So it only makes sense for us, for the Azure DevOps team, to make a very prominent offer for open source developers. So we give unlimited build minutes to open source projects, and we're not picky about your license. So I say open source, but what that means is your project is public so that anybody can browse it on either GitHub or Azure repos, and the builds themselves are public as well. So you'll get 10 parallel build agents that you can use for your project, and unlimited build minutes. I think that is the most generous in the industry. I hope so. If it's not, we'll have to go refine that. And it's very, very simple to get started. You can just click on the GitHub Marketplace. We've got an app inside that marketplace. But what I really want to do is actually drill down into how this works. So let me actually just show some demos. So right here, right there we go. So right here I've got a really, really simple, this is a Node.js application. And I developed this on my Mac, and what I actually want to do is set up a build and release pipeline. Or actually no, let's just set up a build pipeline for now. So what I really want to do is validate my open source project. What I want to do is take contributions from the community. So this is a public project up on GitHub. It's a calculator. It's a very, very simple calculator. So it's a web page that allows you to, 1 + 1. And then there's a back end that has REST APIs. So it will actually do arithmetic over a REST API in case you ever needed 1 + 1 as a service. This is the project for you. So I don't think I'm going to get a ton of contributors to this open source project. However, if I do, what I really want is to make sure that their contributions, if they open up a pull request, that their contributions are good. So I want to make sure that their pull request builds, and that all my tests pass. So it is extremely easy to get started. If you're using Azure DevOps in Azure repos, for example, if your code's in Azure repos, then this is just over on the left side. You can just click your builds. If your code is in GitHub, what you can do is get started with the GitHub Marketplace extension. So I'm just going to search for Azure Pipelines here. And I can go ahead and enable it. And again, it'll walk me through the pricing. It's free for open source projects. We also have a free tier with a limited number of minutes for all your private projects as well. And you can, of course, upgrade after that. All you have to do is select where you want it installed. I've already got it on a couple of accounts, including like my other open source projects. So I've set up an organization just for this. Click install it for free. And what this will do is actually bind your GitHub repository or organization or identity to an Azure DevOps organization. And if you don't have one, you can actually go ahead and get started right here with creating one. So I'm going to select my account. Then it's going to ask me where I want to put this. Again, I could use an existing Azure DevOps organization, or I can create a new one. I'm just going to go ahead and use all these defaults. So I've got a brand new organization that'll get created. And Azure DevOps, like our offer on GitHub, there is no charge for creating an Azure DevOps organization with up to 5 users or for open source. There we go. Once that gets set up, it is actually just going to walk me through the creation of my first build pipeline. You'll notice 2 things. First, if you are an Azure DevOps user, you might be used to seeing more over here, like boards and repos. Again, one of the goals of moving from Team Foundation Server to Azure DevOps was that we could actually break Team Foundation Server up into different components. So right here, I'm just using Azure Pipelines. I don't have any of the other things enabled. I don't have that visual clutter. I'm not using those products by and large. The other thing you'll notice is that it actually has gone ahead and located all my GitHub projects. So I have 2 in that GitHub organization. It's the calculator, the one on the bottom that I want to build a pipeline for. There we go. And when it does that, it will actually, let me scroll over. Well, it will actually look at the code that I have on GitHub and try to identify what it is. And it's going to show me a number of sort of out-of-the-box pipelines that I can use for my application. It thinks I've got a Node.js app, which is exactly what I have. And so that's the one on top. So I can just go ahead and click right there. And then what it's going to do is it's going to show me YAML. If you are, here, let me shrink that so we can get a little more. There we go. If you are not familiar with YAML, I think it stands for yet another markup language, because that's what we need in our lives, is still another one. But YAML is incredibly popular for CI, CD, and other DevOps tools. So it's the way that we define and build our pipelines. You can also use the visual editor if you want. If you've been in Azure DevOps or VSTS or TFS user for a while, you might be more familiar with the graphical mechanism for defining build and release pipelines. Still there. We really encourage you to go with YAML though, and define it programmatically. The reason is that you can check this in to your version control system. So that's called configuration as code. So now, when I've got my build in my actual source tree, when I create a branch, I don't have to go and try to clone that build definition because I branched the code, and the code includes this. So the other nice thing is, as I continue to build the software, maybe I'll add dependencies, maybe I'll change the way that my build works. If I want to go back to an old version, I've still got the old build description. So I always know how to build the version of the software that I'm checking out because that build definition is checked right in. It's very, very handy. So that's what we encourage you to do, is actually use YAML. And so the YAML that it gives me is good. Up here, basically, I'm building on the master branch. I'm using the hosted build agents that Azure DevOps provides. This is on Ubuntu 16.04. Again, we've got Linux, Mac, Windows. I want to build on Linux. And basically, all I do is set up Node.js. I want to use Node.js version 10. So this is a build task that does that. It'll just make sure that 10 is the currently operating version. And then it runs npm install and npm run build. If you're not a Node.js developer, npm install installs dependencies. It's basically like a NuGet restore, or, okay, now we're out of, that's all I got. Don't know a lot of packaging systems. Cargo, up, Rust up, whatever, doesn't matter. npm install, and then npm run build will actually run the build step as defined in your npm, in your Node project's package.json. If you had a TypeScript application, for instance, that might do the TypeScript to JavaScript transpilation. If you have tests, you could run them as part of that as well. I want to do a little bit more, and this is a good default. I think this is fine. This is a great way to get started. I've actually got a slightly more advanced one right here. So I'm going to copy and paste that right in so that it may not be obvious. Maybe it is, since that cursor's blinking. It wasn't obvious to me the first time I saw this, that this is actually an editor. This is actually the Monaco editor. It's the same thing that's in VS Code for when you're just getting started. So if you do want to make changes as you're creating your pipeline, you can do that. And so I'll just copy and paste that right in. I'm still going to use the Ubuntu pool. And I'm still going to use Node.js 10. But I'm doing a few more steps. So npm install is the same, npm run build. And then I'm going to do npm run test. So what I've got is Node unit tests that run in Mocha. If you're familiar with the ecosystem, that's how that's set up. If you're not, I have Node unit tests. What those Node unit tests do is spit out an XML file with the test results. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this. Most test tools can do this. They certainly can in the .NET space. So what I want to do is I want to take that XML and I want to publish it to Azure Pipelines. So this will do two things. First, you can view the test results at a glance. Second, you can actually get some analytics into the test. So you can see, a particular test, how often does it fail, when was the last time it failed, and that sort of thing. The other thing that I want to do is run and publish code coverage. So just like I'm publishing my test results to Azure Pipelines, I can publish my code coverage results. So when I click save and run, what it's going to do is it's going to check this in. Best practice, always use a pull request, get that code review. But I'm going to be sloppy about it just now. Don't emulate this. And so what it's going to do is it's going to check this YAML file into my GitHub repository and start my first build. So that'll take just a second as that all kicks off. There we go. And so what it's going to do is it's going to, again, find a hosted build agent. I could use an on-premises build agent if I want. I can mix and match for any particular project. I can have the hosted build pool that we provide for you, or I can use on-premises build agents. I can use a mix of either one. On-premises build agents are particularly interesting when you have really, really hairy requirements that even a container can't solve. Some people have builds that require software and libraries that still need like an actual physical hardware dongle for copy protection. And that's not a thing that we can do in the cloud, I'm afraid. So a lot of people are still using on-premises build agents as part of their solution. And I love to watch this. This is the actual output of the build process. So what it's done is it's done that npm install, which again downloads any of the dependencies that I have. It runs the npm run build, and then it's doing the tests. These are the tests right here. So I'm actually walking through my unit tests. Okay, so everything's good. Everything turned green. That means my build worked. My tests were successful. So let's ship it. So my actual goal here was to actually take code from contributors. And so in addition to checking in the YAML, Azure Pipelines has also set itself up as a validation step within GitHub. So if I go back to my GitHub repository, there we go. Now, let me pretend to be a contributor, somebody who finds this open source project and wants to actually work on it. Maybe they're browsing the code, trying to understand what it does. And let's scroll down. And this is weird. So if I were coming to a project and I don't know anything, or maybe I even do know something about JavaScript, I would look at this and think that this is very strange. So I've just got some operations mapping to a function. Divide divides A and B. Multiply multiplies A and B. Subtract subtracts B from A. Pretty straightforward, except for add. Add looks weird. Add isn't adding A and B. Add is adding plus A plus B. And that's weird. Certainly it's not very readable. And so maybe as a contributor, somebody stumbling across this open source project, I would say, well, that's stupid. If you aren't familiar with open source projects, most people who find your open source project will actually just say that right off the bat. They'll look at something in your code and say, well, that's stupid. So let's change it. Let's change it to just A plus B. Obviously, that's the correct thing to do here. Let's scroll down and create a pull request. So we'll create a branch. There we go. Create that pull request. And so now what's going to happen is this is going to go from green meaning that there are no conflicts. That's the first thing that GitHub does, or any source code control provider does when you open a pull request, is it checks for conflicts. Can you actually do the merge? And the second thing it'll do is right now GitHub is looking at all the validations that we have configured. They're called checks, and it's queuing them up. So it's now turned to yellow. So what it's done is it's told Azure Pipelines that there is now a pull request that it needs to build. I can even click on details and open up the checks and then go to Azure Pipelines. And so it's going to do this same build. It's going to do that npm install. It's going to do npm run build. And finally, npm run test. And what that will do is it'll allow me to get a good feeling about my there we go. Whoops. There we go. It'll let me get a good feeling about my build and test quality from that pull request. So you can notice that here in the build, something's actually gone wrong. We've actually failed a test. It's really weird that that would fail a test. What's happened? And if we go back to the GitHub pull request and hit reload, what we see is that this has actually blocked us. That test failed, and now we have a big red X telling us not to merge the pull request. So we know that there was a problem with this contribution with the open source contributor. What's happened is we were adding 21 and 21. We expect our result to be 42, but JavaScript, how many people are familiar with JavaScript and its type system? Yeah, it has one type, it's called string. So what we've actually done is concatenated 21 and 21 and gotten 2121, and that's not arithmetic, that's string concatenation. So our build has in fact failed. So this was right. This plus A plus plus B was correct, because by sticking that plus sign in front of our variable, we've coerced that string into a number. So we can actually do real arithmetic on it. And even though that looks weird and it's not at all obvious, it is correct. And by having a build and release pipeline defined here, we've actually kept our open source project safe, and done so very simply by just setting up that build and release pipeline. Sorry, just a build pipeline. There's no release here. Oh yeah, plenty of time.
Sorry, before you go too far.
Yeah.
Very early on, I blinked and missed something, because when you was setting up your container on Azure, I thought you said you were setting up a new organization.
Mm-hmm.
But when you got there, you already had a Hello World project.
So what it did was it found it was looking at my GitHub projects.
Ah, right. Okay. No, I'm happy.
Okay.
Let's move on.
Yeah. So it was identifying which GitHub repository I wanted to create. Yeah. No, that's fine. And in fact, yeah, this is that other GitHub repository right here. So this is a .NET Core application, and what I'm actually doing here is doing a build inside of, or creating a container. So I've got a Docker file, and there's a couple of ways you could create a container. You could either spin up the container and do the build inside of it. You could do the build and take the artifacts and package them up into a container. I'm doing this because I don't know anything about ASP.NET, and this was the sample application. So I've taken it and I've decided that that's the best way to do this. What it's going to do is build this very, very simple .NET Core Hello World application. This is literally the simplest application I could come up with. It doesn't even have HTML tags. It just says Hello World. I told you I didn't know anything about ASP.NET Core. My goal here is to actually get this released, though, into Azure. I've got an Azure web app right here. I've just started it, and this is the ASP.NET greeting page. This is the standard ASP.NET container, the sample application. And what I want to do is actually replace this with my even simpler Hello World application. So what I want to do is, and I've already got an Azure DevOps account set up here, and the reason for that is because what I want to do is publish to an Azure container registry, and I don't want you to know the password, lest you, I don't know, start Bitcoin mining on me before I can go change it. So what I've done is I've actually just set up a library with variables in it that I can refer to in my build process. So I've done a little bit of setup ahead of this. And what I want to do is create a new build pipeline. And I can, again, go through that sort of the GitHub flow where I start in GitHub and ended up in Azure Pipelines. I can also select a GitHub repository here from within Azure Pipelines.
Quick question.
Yeah.
The repositories, can you still use like the old TFS repository?
Yeah, you can. The thing we don't support with a TF, the question was, can I still use TFVC or old style TFS repositories instead of Git? The answer is yes, but no YAML in those. You have to use the visual designer for those. And that is a lot to do with the differences between TFVC's branching strategies versus Git's. Oh my. Maybe I should have gone the other way. It's going to try to load all my repositories over this Wi-Fi. So let's actually just go ahead and, whoops. Okay, well, I think what we want to do is go through the GitHub application because I didn't get this all quite set up just right before I did this. So let's again go through the Azure Pipelines. There we go. And edit our plan to configure access. Or did we already do that? Well, it looks like we already did that. Sorry, let's just, there we go. No, it's already set up. Okay. Now we debug GitHub talking to Azure repos.
It's very comforting to see you do this.
I know,
this is
right?
something most of us do on a daily basis.
I know, I know. It's true. Right. The problem is, well, let's just go ahead and do this. All right, well, let's go ahead and let's start over. That's clearly the key. I have no idea what this is bound to if it's not my demo account. Because those repositories, there they go. No? All right, we'll let that load a second. In the meantime, right. Well, while that loads, why don't I actually just switch a little bit? I'm not going to sit there and wait for it. And talk a little bit about the way we use this within Microsoft. So Azure DevOps, I think I mentioned, is used within Microsoft both for web applications like Azure DevOps itself. What I'm trying to find a better word for than legacy, but older applications that actually ship in a box, like Windows or Office, and all of them use like different components of it. So we're trying to move everybody into all of Azure DevOps. Every team within Microsoft has some bespoke challenges, like the Windows team has an incredibly huge source tree that we had to actually make changes to the Git version control system to support. But almost all the teams are actually using pipelines for build and release. So let me close that to give us some more room. Within Azure DevOps itself, we're doing this on a day-to-day basis. Every single bit of code does come through a pull request. So it will run continuous integration builds on every single code change that we make. It'll go through the pull request process, it will queue builds, and it will run all of our unit tests. So you can dig in here on a project. We can actually look at all of our test coverage. So we run about 90,000 almost unit tests on every pull request that gets created. And we expect 100% to pass. We do actually, we do have failing tests, and those pull requests do not get merged until they are actually fixed. If I go back here, I thought I saw at least one that was failing. There we go. And this failed a test. Ensure REST client's up to date. So this person has not taken a dependency. They just need to do a get latest, do a fetch, and merge the latest changes into their code base, and they should be good to go. So they'll iterate on this pull request. It'll queue a new build when they push up new changes, and they should be good. The other thing that we use is not just the build and not just continuous integration. Once these things land in master, we'll do another build, and those builds, pull request builds are just for validation, just to make sure that the changes are okay. Once the code actually gets merged and lands in master, we'll do another build, and those will actually be build artifacts that we can deploy. And we use Azure Pipelines for our deployment as well. This is, so amusingly, maybe not amusingly, despite the fact that Azure DevOps changes its name with some regularity, we are no longer TFS, but we actually have several services within the architecture that we call Azure DevOps when we're talking about the development. One of those is SPS, VSSF. One of them is called TFS. So TFS will always live on as a slice of Azure DevOps. And this is the bit of the product that actually gets released. And so these components are part of our project called TFS. So when we deploy a new version of our software, we deploy TFS to everybody. Let me look at this deployment that's in progress right here. And you can get an idea of the way that we use Azure Pipelines for our deployment. Oh, no, sorry. Let me look at something that's not waiting on an approval. Here we go. So what you can see here on the right are the different stages of the deployment process. So let me look up this one. Here we go. So that's performing an update. You can actually see the commands that are being run as part of that. But what I want to actually see is which one? That's the one. Is the actual map of where things are going. So my colleague Matt, triggered this, and you actually get a tie-in to the build that he was using to deploy. And so this is going to our actual production environment to do a hotfix for what is in production. I don't have a lot of information. I can drill down, so I can click on the build and then click on the pull request to see the actual code changes that are involved. And that will show me exactly what is being deployed into production. So from the release, I can click on the build. There we go. It's actually that one right there. And then from there, I can actually look at the branch. So this is actually getting this is our release branch. This is basically mapping to production. And so I can see exactly the code changes that are going in when I click history, and I can see the various pull requests that got merged. So coming back here, the other interesting thing, that was that one, right? The other interesting thing about this is that I mentioned earlier today that we do what we call ringed deployments. And our release targets are actually named after rings. So ring 0 is the first place that our releases go. There was actually a failure there, interestingly. We've got several ring 0s. And so those are basically our canary deployments. Those are our internal deployments. So if there is a problem with one of these rings, maybe it's throwing exceptions, maybe the feature doesn't work, then we won't promote it to other rings. And that's what this promotion looks like. Let me try to zoom out. Oh, goodness. There we go. So what this actually looks like for us is a ring 0 deployment and then a manual approver gate. Once we're happy with the deployment that lands in ring 0, we can promote it to the next stage, which is what we call ring 1. And that goes to a scale unit, 2 different scale units rather. And we leave that on. So basically progressive exposure. So internal customers, some external customers. So the Microsoft MVPs can opt in to seeing the new features. The good thing is they get the new features very quickly because they're early in the release cycle, in the exposure. The bad news is that if there's a bug, they are going to see it first. But once we have a high degree of confidence in ring 1, we move to ring 2, then ring 3, and ultimately, so ring 2 is going to be largely United States. Over here we've got ring 3, which is Western Europe, and you can see this is code changes going out right now to a Western European scale unit. I forget where the UK is. We just enabled Azure DevOps in the UK. The question is, are these across billing accounts? You are asking about Azure billing accounts. They could be. So when we do, quote unquote, do a deployment, all we're really doing is running a couple of steps like take this zip file or take this Docker image and publish it to that thing over there. And that thing over there is largely arbitrary. It could be an Azure virtual machine. It could be an Azure web app. It could be AWS. So yeah, there's no requirement that these are in any way tied together. I could be deploying half of this to AWS, half to Azure, and another half to on-premises. The only requirement is that either we know how to deploy to it because it's an Azure resource, or it's running the release application. There's a little app that basically will pull the artifacts down and do the deployment on your machine or within your network. AWS has an application as well, so you can install the AWS extension to do this if you're using AWS. So no, there's no real requirement that there's any sort of relationship between these things. Yeah?
Sorry, did you say that the app that does the deployment, the agent that you install, is that pull, did you say?
That's correct.
Rather than a push from Azure to...
Yeah. So our agent, the release agent that if you want to run on premises, the release agent pulls Azure DevOps and downloads the artifacts, so you don't need to open a hole in the firewall. Is the reason that we do it that way.
Are you going to cover about the testing suites?
Right, testing suites. What are you using?
I'm using normal MS Test, but I also use TypeMock, which is another mocking framework.
Okay.
And I have tried connecting in and kind of hit some brick walls. So I'm just wondering if there are those kind of frameworks. That's just one area. I'd love to shove it all into Azure and
Right.
get at it.
Right.
But yeah, I just wondering how you release your tests and add in marketplace goodies, I guess.
Yeah, so the question was around test frameworks. And by and large, we're very agnostic about the test framework. If you are bringing a .NET application and you are using XUnit, for example, we don't really honestly care what you're using. We're just going to run XUnit test or .NET test or whatever to actually run the test. So by and large, you're responsible for A, writing your tests, and B, selecting a framework. We're just going to run it. So we don't actually provide a lot of, if you're not happy with your test framework, you're still going to not be happy with it. We're just going to run it faster. So you'll be not happy at scale. Sorry. But why don't we chat and we can see if we can figure out how to improve that. I don't think there's a way within Azure DevOps, but there may be, I may have some idea of a product that Microsoft does have or a project. So, right, so if anybody does want to hang out and see a container-based build and deployment, I suspect that the Wi-Fi has probably caught up and loaded that list of repositories. However, I am out of time, so I want to be respectful of that and make sure that you can get to the next session and that the next speaker can set up. So I will hang out. If you guys have any more questions, happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming.